Yeah, 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 yeah. So, the next thing I'd like to introduce you to is 8 golden rules for singing high-intensity vocals, loud and bright at the top of your register. Rule number 1 is you should not attempt to sing a high-intensity vocal without doing some kind of vocal warm-up. If you launch into your highest and brightest sounds without doing something to prepare your vocal cords for it, it's like trying to sprint a race as you get out of bed. It's never going to work. So there are a couple of things that you should think of, but you should develop a good vocal warm-up regime in conjunction with a singing teacher or a vocal coach. But as an example, the sort of things that I would do to make sure my vocal mechanism is ready for a higher intensity sing would be things like tongue trills, doing a siren of a fifth and then a siren of an octave. So, taking a breath, and working out whether your voice really is up to doing the sort of intensity of vocal that you're about to launch into. Rule number 2, your support when you're singing at a high intensity has to be active. By that I mean, if you're not physically engaged with your body, all of your activity is going to be directed to your throat mechanisms, and that's probably going to cause constriction and tension, and you often see rock singers with veins and muscles popping out of their necks, which could potentially be damaging. So you need to think about where are you actively engaged in supporting your voice. This doesn't mean locking your knees, tightening your hips, and sticking your chest out. It means simply finding points of balance and making sure that your body is ready to do the work that it's about to do. Rule number 3. I don't really want you to think about pulling your larynx up, but a number of methods of singing teach particularly male singers to keep their larynx low. If you want a very classical sound, you may have been taught to press your larynx down. When you're doing high-intensity rock vocals, you need to be able to allow your larynx to rise. And by that, I don't mean pulling it up into the top of your throat, because that will also give you problems with constriction. But if you think of shouting across a busy road to get someone's attention, so a friend of yours across the road that you really want to meet up with, if you want to get their attention, you'll go, "Hey!" And that "hey," if you deconstruct it, your larynx has raised. So that's the sort of sound that we're aiming for, a highly projected "hey," which will only happen if your larynx is allowed to move up. So rule number 4 is the breath. This is quite a tricky one to manage, because most people associate a higher breath volume and pressure on the exhale with a higher and louder note. But when you get into the really intense high vocals, that's not the case. When you look at the vocal cords through a scope, when people are singing very high and very bright, the vocal cords are together for about 70% of a cycle. If you think of the reverse of that, that means they're apart for 30% of a cycle, which means there's very little time in which air can escape. So if you push a lot of air using your abdominal muscles, you will actually force the vocal cords into a position that is all wrong for high intensity singing. So if we go back a rule to "hey," if you then extend that and make it a longer note, you'll find that you can end up with a "yeah." There's very little air escaping. And if I really want to extend that note and make it higher and brighter, I almost think of inhaling as I hit the note. I don't breathe deep, which is what we would normally do to support a note. I take a very short breath, because I'm not going to need very much, and then let the larynx come up, go for the note in a high and bright way, and think of inhaling rather than exhaling. So by that I mean, rather than "yeah," it's much more of a "hey," very breath efficient. On to rule number 5. I'm a great believer in allocating numbers to effort. So when you get to high intensity vocals, you need to think about where these numbers are going to be placed. Singing involves obviously using the vocal cords, and the vocal cords at their center are a muscle. So your vocal cords need to be allocated a number. It's really easy in high intensity vocals to give your vocal cords a very high number. This is probably not a good idea because a lot of the work is going to be this closed phase that we talked about in the previous rule. So your vocal cords have to do some work, but don't allocate them a high number. Think of a number around 2 or 3. That's about as intense as you ever want to work your vocal cords, because psychologically you are then less likely to constrict everything because you're thinking of working in this area. We've also decided that you don't need a huge amount of breath. So I would allocate the ab region a really low number, something like 2, so that you're not breathing deep and pressing air out from the abs. What I would do is allocate the upper back a high number. It's a great distraction therapy as well, because it means you're thinking about how do I actively use my back. You might think about pressing your shoulders into the floor. You might think about the lat pull down in the gym. You might want to press down on something in front of you, and you'll feel your muscles bunch under your armpit. Those are your lats. So if you give those a big number, these a low number, this a low number, and actually engage in it, then you'll find you get a yeah! This is all tight, this is all loose, this is all loose, but you are still creating a high, bright sound. Rule number 6 is a little bit of a psychological trick, but at its core, it makes a great deal of sense. A number of singers that I've worked with go for volume. So before they get to the note, in their head, they are aiming for loud. If your end result is to aim for loud, you're likely to get into difficulty. If you think about it as getting it right, and the end result will be loud, so you sort of reverse the thought process, then what you're concentrating on is great technique, concentrating on getting the emotional delivery right, but not concentrating on loud. Because if you aim for loud, it's really easy for singing to become a shout. And although you're aiming for a type of a shout alone, without all of the support mechanisms, can be quite dangerous on the vocal cords. So aim to get it right and believe that the end result will be loud. So rule number 7 is learn to twang and learn to twang well. Twang is discussed extensively in these videos, and any good vocal tutor will help you get into that na 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 na, because with very little effort you immediately get a great result in that you get cut edge, you get a metallic sound, you get a very bright and edgy sound. So when you're doing the end of your warm-up before you launch into whatever your vocal phrase is, do some exercises that are really high in twang. So maybe octave leaps. So you're getting yeah, 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 and make sure the top note is really, really bright and twangy, because then with less effort, you'll get a much bigger result. So rule number 8 is before you actually launch into the phrase that you want to achieve, think about removing all of the consonants. Vowels are a much easier way to sing through phrases because consonants have a tendency to stop sound. So pick a favorite vowel and use that to get you into a phrase. So as an example, if we were to work on Bon Jovi, I want to lay you down, that phrase, if you put everything together with just your favorite vowel, might become yeah, 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 yeah. because you're just using the vowel to take you to the notes and getting rid of the problems that would be associated with consonants. Putting even more twang through a phrase like that, bearing in mind that you need very little breath, you might even want to try and do a really long phrase in one breath, even if when you sing the phrase, you use several breaths for aesthetic reasons. So the same phrase might become, yeah, yeah. You can go a long time on one breath on a really well-twanged vowel, very high and very bright. That's the point at which you then put everything together, add the consonants, put the words into the phrase, and then try singing. However, at the end, as with the beginning, I've got to say this is very high, very bright. It can be quite dangerous if you don't do this supervised. So I would never work in this area of my voice without going through stuff with a good vocal coach or a good singing teacher before launching into it.